What would you do if you rode into a town with nothing but a saddle blanket and the clothes on your back, and a stranger handed you the deed to a broken-down farm for free, laughing as he did it? That is what happened to a 20-year-old girl named Lucy Boone the summer she came into Dry Creek. Everyone in that dusty valley said the place was cursed, worthless, a punishment more than a gift. But what she would uncover near that old barn, buried in the hard red dirt, would change the story every one of them thought they knew. Settle in. Pour something warm. Let us know where you're watching from. And stay close, because the wind on the ridge is already turning. Lucy Boone came into Dry Creek on foot in the last hour before sundown, leading a bay gelding whose ribs showed through his dusty coat like the staves of an old barrel. She was thin herself, thin in a way that could not be hidden by the loose gray dress or the man's canvas coat she had cinched at the waist with a length of rope. Her boots were split at the toe. Her braid, the color of wheat left too long in the sun, hung heavy down her back. Under the shadow of her broad hat, her eyes were the pale, careful eyes of a person who had learned to watch for weather in every face she passed. 2 years she had drifted. 2 years since her father had lost the little house outside Bakersfield to a note he could not pay, and the county men had come with paper and told her, at 18, that there was no room for her in the arrangement. Her father had gone west with a work crew and never written. Her mother had been in the churchyard longer than that. Lucy had gone from a laundry in one town to a kitchen in another, from a hayloft to a wagon seat, from a bunk in a shearing shed to the open road when the shearing was done. She had learned to sleep sitting up. She had learned that a girl alone was a question every stranger felt free to answer for her. Dry Creek did not look like an answer. It looked like a row of leaning storefronts strung along a rutted street. A livery, a saloon with its doors flung open on the heat. A church whose white paint had gone the color of bone. Men on the boardwalk turned to watch her pass, and their eyes were the eyes she had grown used to. Not unkind, exactly, only measuring, the way a man measures a stray dog to see whether it will bite or beg. She did neither. She led the bay to the water trough at the end of the street, let him drink, and rested her hand on his warm neck while she thought about what came next. She had $2 and a folded letter in her pocket. The letter was from a woman she had worked for one winter, a woman who had told her that in Dry Creek there was land no one wanted, and a girl with strong hands and no fear of quiet might do worse than to ask after it. Lucy had ridden 4 days to ask. The bay lifted his head. Water dripped from his muzzle onto the dust. He blew softly through his nose, as if he too were considering the town. She had bought him for $8 from a farrier who was going to shoot him, and she had named him Amos after a preacher who had once given her a loaf of bread without asking anything back. He was 15 years old and sound in 3 legs and mostly in the 4th. He was the only living thing that belonged to her. Across the street, a bell rang once inside the land office. A man in shirt sleeves stepped out onto the boardwalk, looked at her the way the others had, and looked longer. The man in shirt sleeves was named Roy Pickett, and he ran the land office and the general store and, by most accounts, half the opinions in Dry Creek. He was broad through the middle and pink in the face, with a pocket watch strung across his waistcoat and a laugh that came easy and never quite reached his eyes. When Lucy crossed the street and asked, in the quiet, level voice she had trained herself to use with strange men, whether there was any land in the valley a person might come by cheap, Roy Pickett laughed that laugh. "Cheap," he said. "Girl, I've got land I'll give you." She waited. "The Hanley place," he said, and glanced at 2 men leaning on the rail. Both of them grinned as though a joke had begun without them. Old Ambrose Hanley died out there 4 winters back. No heirs come forward. County holds the paper. Nobody'll take it, not for love nor money. Barn's half down. House ain't much better. Well's gone brackish, they say. Grass burnt to nothing. He tipped his hat back with one thumb. You want it, it's yours. Sign here and don't come crying when the roof falls in. One of the men on the rail said, Give her a shovel too, Roy. She'll need it to dig her own grave. The laughter that followed was the laughter Lucy had heard in a dozen towns. She let it pass over her the way she had learned to let weather pass. She looked at Roy Pickett and asked, How much? $1, he said, for the filing, and a promise you'll work it a year, or the county takes it back. Nobody's ever made the year. He was already reaching for the ledger, still smiling. He thought he was giving her nothing. He thought he was making a story he could tell at supper. Lucy laid one of her $2 on the counter. She wrote her name in a careful, schoolgirl hand, Lucy Boone, and under it, the date, and under that, the words she had rehearsed on the road. Sole occupant and worker of the described parcel. Roy Pickett stamped it without reading. He slid a folded map across the counter and told her the place lay 4 miles east along the creek road, past the split cottonwood, up the rise where the wind never stopped. Good luck, Miss Boone, he said, and the 2 men on the rail were still laughing when she stepped back out into the sun with the paper in her hand and Amos waiting at the trough. She folded the deed once, twice, and pressed it flat against her chest under the canvas coat, over her heart, where nothing had rested in a long time. Would you have signed that paper for $1 and a laugh? Would you have taken a barn half down and a well-gone brackish, with the whole town watching you fail? What did old Ambrose Hanley leave behind in that hard red dirt that not one of them knew to look for? If a story about a quiet girl and a discarded piece of ground is the kind of thing you're glad to sit with, leave a word below and follow along, because Lucy Boone is about to ride east into the wind, and what she finds out there is only just beginning to stir. Word of the filing traveled faster than Lucy did. By the time she stepped out of the land office and walked Amos back down the length of the street, the news had already crossed to the porch of the saloon and doubled back through the open door of the mercantile. Men she had not spoken to lifted their chins to look at her. A woman in a faded blue apron paused on the boardwalk with a bolt of muslin under her arm and watched her pass without smiling. A boy of maybe 10 leaned out over the rail of the feed store and called something to another boy she could not see. And the other boy laughed the high, easy laugh of a child who has been told a thing is funny and does not yet know why. Lucy kept her eyes on the ground, 3 paces ahead of Amos's shoulder. She had learned that the ground 3 paces ahead was the only country that answered when a person looked at it. At the corner where the creek road turned east, 2 men stood in the shade of the awning outside the barber's, and one of them was Roy Pickett. He had not been there a moment before. He had come out to watch her go. The other man was younger and taller, and wore a black coat too heavy for the weather, with a silver watch chain thicker than Roy's own. His boots were clean. In Dry Creek, in that hour, clean boots said more than a name. "Miss Boone?" Roy called, and there was a warmth in it that was not warmth. "This is Mr. Bledsoe. Owns the range north of the Hanley place. Thought you 2 ought to meet, seeing as you'll share a fence line for the year." Bledsoe did not offer his hand. He looked her up and down slowly, from the split-toe boots to the wheat braid, and let his gaze rest on the folded shape of the deed beneath her coat. "You're the one signed for that piece," he said. "I am," Lucy said. He gave a short laugh through his nose. "Girl, that ground has broken older backs than yours. Ambrose Hanley worked it 30 years and it killed him. I heard, Lucy said. When the year runs out and the county takes it back, Bledsoe said. You come see me first. I'll give you fare on the coach out of here. Save you the winter. He said it as though he were being kind. There was no kindness in it. He said it the way a man says a thing when he has already decided how the story ends and only wants her to know he decided. Lucy said nothing. She touched Amos's neck once, at the place where the mane began to thin, and turned him east. She did not get far before an old woman stepped out from between the church and the shuttered smithy. She wore black from her collar to her hem, and a black scarf tied under her chin, and her face was so lined it seemed less a face than a piece of driftwood shaped by long weather. She carried a small tin pail with a few brown eggs settled in straw. Lucy had not seen her on the boardwalk. She had not seen her anywhere. She was simply there in the road, as if she had risen out of the dust for one purpose. Lucy stopped. The old woman looked at her a long moment without speaking. Then she looked at Amos, and something soft moved across her mouth that was not quite a smile. What's under that ground, she said, was set there to be found by the one who stayed. Lucy opened her mouth to ask what she meant. The old woman was already walking on, past her, past Amos, on toward whatever house she kept at the edge of town, her boots making almost no sound in the dust. Lucy watched her until she turned behind the church and was gone. The words settled somewhere below Lucy's ribs, folded and put away, the way one puts away a thing that has no place yet but will. She clicked her tongue at Amos and started east. The creek road ran straight for a mile out of Dry Creek and then began to bend with the water. The creek itself was low, a thin brown ribbon between pale banks, cottonwoods leaning over it in tired rows. The sun had gone from gold to bronze, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched long across the wagon ruts. Amos walked slowly, and Lucy walked beside him. Her legs ached in a familiar way, the ache of a body that had not slept flat in 3 nights. The rope belt at her waist had rubbed a raw place under the canvas coat. She pressed her hand against the folded deed once, to be sure it was still there, and let her hand fall. The split cottonwood stood where Roy Pickett had said it would. A great pale tree cleaved down the center by lightning some year long past, both halves still living, leaves rustling in a wind she could not feel at ground level. Past it, the road climbed a low rise, and past the rise the land opened onto a shallow bowl of ground, the color of rust, with the bones of a fence running along one edge and a stand of thin pines on the ridge behind it. The Hanley place sat at the bottom of the bowl. Lucy stopped at the top of the rise and looked at it a long time before she went down. The house was a low, plank thing, with a stone chimney and a tin roof gone the color of old iron. Half the porch had sagged off its posts and lay in the grass like a shed skin. The barn stood 100 yards to the east of the house, larger than she had expected. Its long wall bowed inward, and its ridge beam dipped low as the spine of a starved horse. The doors hung open on one hinge each. Behind the barn there was a pen with the rails down, and beyond the pen a stone-lined well with its bucket rope frayed and its windlass broken loose. Dry grass, brittle as straw, stood knee-high across the whole yard. There was no smoke from the chimney. There had not been smoke from that chimney in 4 winters. A hawk turned once above the ridge and did not call. Lucy walked Amos down the rise slowly. The last of the sun touched the tin roof and made it, for a moment, the color of honey. And then that color went too, and the whole bowl fell into blue shadow. She left Amos in what remained of the pen with the rails leaned back up as best she could, and she carried her bedroll and her canvas satchel to the porch and sat down on the one step that had not rotted through. The house behind her was cold as a cellar. She could smell it through the open door. Dust, mice, cold ash, and under all of it, the faint, tired sweetness of old pine boards that had held a life once and did not anymore. She did not go inside that first night. She spread her bedroll on the porch boards with her back against the wall of the house, and her boots pointed toward the barn. And she ate a heel of bread and a piece of hard cheese from the satchel. And she watched the stars come out one at a time above the black shape of the barn's broken ridge. The wind that Roy Pickett had promised began after full dark. It came down off the ridge and moved through the dry grass with a long, dry hush, and then it found the loose boards of the barn and made them speak, a slow, uneven knock, then a groan, then a knock again, as if something inside were pacing. Lucy listened. Amos, in the pen, shifted his weight from one hip to the other and let out a long breath that was almost a sigh. She thought of the old woman in the road. What's under that ground was set there to be found by the one who stayed. She turned the words in her mind, the way a person turns a stone in the palm, feeling for the shape of it, and did not yet know which side was up. Somewhere out in the dark, past the barn, an owl called once, and was answered from farther off. And then the wind rose again and covered every other sound. And Lucy Boone closed her eyes on the first night of her 1-year year with the deed folded flat against her heart, and the whole bowl of ground breathing slowly around her, waiting, it seemed, to see whether she would stay. She woke before the sun, in the blue hour when the ridge was a shape and not yet a color, and she lay a moment on the porch boards, remembering where she was. Amos was standing at the pen rail with his ears forward, watching the barn. He was not eating the small tuft of dry grass beside his hoof. He was watching the barn the way a horse watches a thing that has moved once and might move again. Lucy sat up slowly and looked where he looked. The barn stood as it had stood the night before, bowed and hollow and dark, its doors hanging open on their one hinge each. Nothing moved. She rose and went to the pen and put her hand on his neck, and he did not turn his head to her. He kept his eyes on the long, shadowed shape of the building. She walked down to the barn in her sock feet, boots left on the porch, because the ground was cool and she wanted to be quiet. The dew had not risen. The dry grass whispered against her hem. She stopped in the open door of the barn and looked in. The inside was one long room with a loft above and a dirt floor below, and along the back wall 3 stalls stood with their gates fallen off. A broken wagon wheel leaned in one corner. A rusted hay fork lay across a beam. The light came in through the gaps in the wall in long pale bars, and the dust moved in them slowly, and there was nothing in the barn that should not have been in a barn. But at the foot of the middle stall, where the dirt floor met the sill, the ground was not flat. It rose in a low, soft mound, the length of a man's forearm, no wider than a folded coat. The grass had not grown over it the way it had grown over everything else. The dirt on the mound was a shade darker than the dirt around it, as if it had been turned once and then left. Lucy stood in the door and looked at it. She did not go closer. A person who has slept on wagon seats and in shearing sheds learns not to touch a thing before she has looked at it from 3 sides. She walked the long wall of the barn on the outside instead. She counted the boards. She ran her hand along the weathered grain. Halfway down the wall, at about the height of her shoulder, one board sat differently than its neighbors. It was the same age, the same silver gray, the same width, but it had been pulled off once and put back, and the nail heads showed pale rings where they had bitten new wood. Above that board, cut into the beam that ran along the top of the wall, was a mark. Not a knot, not a woodworm's track, a shape scratched with the point of a knife, deep enough to last through 4 winters of wind. A small square with a line through it, and beneath the square, 3 notches in a row. Lucy looked at the mark a long time. She did not know what it meant. She knew only that a man does not carve a sign into his own barn beam for no reason, and that a board pulled and put back has held something between the pulling and the putting. She stepped away from the wall and looked back at the barn as a whole, and it seemed to her a different building than it had been the night before. Not more welcoming, not less broken, but occupied, in some quiet way, by an intention that had outlived the man who set it there. Amos snorted behind her in the pen. She turned and went back to the porch and put her boots on, and did not go near the mound in the middle stall. That first morning she did not dig. She did not pry the loose board. She had learned, on the road, that the ground gives up what it wants to give up when it is ready, and that a person in a hurry finds nothing but the top layer. She had a year. She had a horse. She had a house that had not been swept in 4 winters, and a well that ran brackish, and a barn that would fall the rest of the way down if the wind kept at it. She set the mark and the mound aside in the corner of her mind, the way a woman sets a piece of mending aside on the table, and she went to work on what was in front of her. She started with the porch. She pulled the rotted step and stacked the good wood against the wall of the house. She swept the porch boards with a broom she found leaning inside the door, its straw brittle but still bound. She swept the front room next. The floor was pine, wide-planked, gray with dust, and under the dust it was good. A stove stood in the corner, a small iron thing with its door hanging crooked, and on the shelf above the stove there was a tin cup, a tin plate, a bone-handled knife, and a lantern with half its kerosene still in the bowl. Ambrose Hanley had gone out of this house the way a man goes out of a room he means to come back to. Lucy stood a moment with the lantern in her hand, and understood that she was not the first person to leave a place suddenly. She set the lantern on the table and lit it that night, and it burned clean. By the end of the first week, she had swept every room and hung her bedroll from a beam to air, and set the stove door back on its hinge with a strip of leather cut from her old rope belt. She led Amos down to the creek and back twice a day, and the creek water was clear where the well water was foul, and Amos drank slowly and let her scratch the base of his mane where the hair was thinning. She cut the tall dry grass in the yard with a scythe she found in the barn, its blade dulled but sound, and she carried the cuttings in armfuls to the pen and made him a soft bed of it. She fixed 1 rail of the pen each day, no more, because her hands would take no more. And in each day's work, she found one thing. On the second day she found, tucked between 2 joists in the front room, a stub of pencil and a scrap of brown paper with numbers written in a slow, blocky hand, a column that added and did not seem to reach a total. On the third day, cleaning the stove, she found beneath the ashes a small iron key, blackened, no bigger than her thumb, with a square head and a single tooth. She rubbed it clean on her apron and set it on the shelf next to the tin cup. On the 4th day, sweeping the barn, she had gone in at last, keeping her boots to the edges, not stepping on the middle stall. She found, driven into the post beside the loose board, a nail bent into a small hook, and hanging from the hook nothing but a length of leather thong worn smooth by something once carried on it. Each thing she found she set on the shelf above the stove. She did not speak of them to Amos, because a person who speaks to a horse learns to speak only what she wants to hear said back, and she did not yet know what any of it meant. But she looked at the shelf every night before she blew out the lantern. The tin cup, the tin plate, the bone-handled knife, the stub of pencil, the scrap of paper, the small iron key, the leather thong. And she understood, without saying it, that Ambrose Hanley had left a trail for someone, and that she was walking it whether or not she had meant to. On the seventh night, lying on her bedroll on the swept pine floor of the front room, with the lantern low and Amos breathing steady in the pen, she thought again of the mound in the middle stall and the mark carved in the beam. Her hands, which had learned the shape of the scythe and the broom and the loose rail and the lantern's wick, felt now as though they had been learning something else, all week, without her permission. She turned onto her side and looked at the small iron key on the shelf, and the key caught a little of the lantern light and held it, and she closed her eyes and slept. And outside the wind moved through the barn and made the loose board tap once against its neighbor softly, the way a person taps a table to be remembered. The eighth morning came in slow and gray, with a low ceiling of cloud over the ridge and no wind at all, and Lucy Boone woke knowing before her eyes opened that the day was the one. She did not eat. She drew water from the creek for Amos and put a hand on his neck longer than usual, and Amos turned his head and rested his nose against her shoulder for the space of 2 breaths, and then went back to his hay. She took the spade she had straightened the day before from where it leaned against the porch post, and she took the small iron key from the shelf and put it in her apron pocket, and she walked to the barn. Inside, in the pale light coming through the open doors, the mound in the middle stall looked no different than it had on the first morning. She stood at the foot of the stall and looked at it a long moment. Then she stepped in and set the point of the spade at the edge of the mound and pressed it down with her boot. The dirt gave easily. It had been turned once, and not so long ago that the earth had knit itself back together. She worked around the edges first, lifting shallow slices and setting them aside in a neat row along the sill, the way her mother had once set potato peels along the edge of a board. She worked for a quarter hour, and the mound became a shallow bowl, and the shallow bowl became a hole to the depth of her forearm, and then the spade struck something that was not stone and not root. She knelt. She set the spade aside and worked with her hands, brushing the dirt from the top of what she had struck. A curve of tin appeared, then the flat lid of a box, then the whole of it. A tin the size of a family Bible, its lid held down by a small brass hasp, and through the hasp a small iron lock no bigger than her thumb, with a square head and a single keyhole. She sat back on her heels and looked at the lock a long time. Then she took the key from her apron pocket and fitted it in, and the key turned, stiff at first, and then clean, and the hasp fell open in her palm. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth gone brittle at its folds, were 3 things. She took them out one at a time, in the light coming through the barn door, and set each on the oilcloth spread on her knee. The first was a leather pouch, closed with a drawstring, and inside the pouch were 22 coins, gold small, each one the weight of a musket ball, dulled by their years underground, but still catching the gray light and giving it back warmer. The second was a folded paper, thick, with the county seal pressed into its wax, and on the outside in the same slow, blocky hand that had written the numbers on the brown scrap. 3 words, for the stayer. The third was a small book, cloth-bound, its spine cracked, its pages soft with damp but still legible, and on its first page, written in that same hand, the words, Ambrose Hanley, his account, being a true record of this ground and what is owed upon it. Lucy sat in the stall with the 3 things on her knee, and for a long while she did not read and did not count. She looked at the barn wall opposite her, at the loose board and the mark above it, the small square with the line through it, the 3 notches. And she saw now that the square was the tin, and the line through it was the key, and the 3 notches were 3 things, and that Ambrose Hanley had left a map on his own wall for a person he did not know and had trusted to arrive. She opened the folded paper first. It was a deed. In her hand, a second deed, older than her own by many years, made out in the name of Ambrose Hanley for the parcel described as the Hanley place, and beneath the deed a second sheet, pinned to it with a straight pin gone rusty, which was a letter of intent, signed and witnessed, stating in the plainest terms that Ambrose Hanley, having no living kin, willed the whole of his parcel and its improvements, and what he had put into its ground, to whatever soul stayed upon it, and worked it for 1 full year after his death, and that the coin buried with this letter was intended as the means by which that soul might redeem the parcel from any lien, tax, or claim brought against it, and pay the county what was owed, and hold the ground free. Lucy read it twice. Then she opened the book. The book was a ledger of the ground, what he had planted, what had grown, what had failed, which years the creek had run low and which it had run high, where the good soil lay and where the ground turned to clay, which of the pines on the ridge would give a straight beam and which were rotten at the heart. It was 30 years of a man's attention to one piece of earth, written slowly, without flourish, in the hand of a person who meant to be understood. On the last page, dated in the 4th winter past, was a single line. The lien is Bledsoe's paper, and it is not lawful. He was told. He did not listen. The ground is for the one who stays. Lucy closed the book. She put it back in the tin, and the pouch of coins, and the deed, and the letter, and she closed the lid and turned the key and put the key in her apron pocket. She lifted the tin out of the hole and carried it, cradled against her chest under her canvas coat, the way she had carried her own folded deed on the first day, back to the house. She set it on the pine floor of the front room, in the corner by the stove where the wall was soundest. She did not put it on the shelf. The shelf was for the small found things. The tin was the thing they had been leading to. She stood a long moment with her hand flat on the lid. Outside, without any warning, the wind that had been absent all morning began, low at first through the grass, and then rising, and the gray ceiling of cloud came down on the ridge and folded over it, and started east across the valley toward the house. By mid-afternoon, the sky over the Hanley place had gone the color of a bruise, and the pines on the ridge were bent in one long line, and the first hard drops of rain struck the tin roof like buckshot. Lucy had brought Amos into the barn and tied him in the far stall away from the middle one, and she had shut the barn doors with a length of wire threaded through the 2 hinges where the latches had gone. She had wedged the loose board back into the wall with a wooden peg. She had brought her bedroll inside the house and stoked the stove with the split porch wood, and she had set the tin on the floor beside her and covered it with her canvas coat. The storm came down on the valley with the whole weight of the season behind it. Rain sheeted off the tin roof in ropes. The wind found every loose thing on the place and rattled it. A shutter she had not yet mended banged against the outside of the house until she went out into the rain and tied it flat with a length of leather thong. She stood on the porch a moment in the wet, looking east through the gray toward the barn, and she saw a shape moving on the creek road, low and stumbling, coming down the rise. She thought it was a calf at first, blown from Bledsoe's range. Then she saw it was a woman. Lucy went out into the storm without her coat, because her coat was over the tin. She met the woman halfway between the porch and the road. The woman was thin, older than Lucy, but not old, her hair plastered to her face, her dress heavy with rain. one arm around a small boy of perhaps 4, whose face was pressed into her side. Behind her, no wagon, no horse, only her own 2 feet, and the boy's. "Please," the woman said. Her voice was small in the wind. Lucy did not answer. She took the boy from the woman's arm and settled him against her own hip, and she took the woman's elbow in her free hand and turned her toward the house, and the 3 of them went up the porch step together and through the door. Inside, Lucy set the boy on her bedroll by the stove and put a blanket around him. The woman stood in the middle of the room, dripping and shaking, and Lucy pulled the second blanket from the peg and put it around her shoulders and steered her to the stove. She did not ask any questions. She put the kettle on and cut 2 thick slices of bread from what was left in her satchel and set them on the tin plate on the shelf, and she took the tin cup down and poured hot water over a pinch of the last of her tea and gave it to the woman. The woman drank. Her hands shook so that the cup rattled against her teeth. The boy watched Lucy over the edge of the blanket with dark round eyes and did not speak. "My husband," the woman said, after a long time. "The creek took the wagon. He got us to the bank, then he went back for the mare." Lucy waited. "He did not come back," the woman said. Lucy looked at the door, and at the window where the rain ran down the glass in sheets, and at the boy on her bedroll. She thought of Amos in the barn. She thought of the tin under her coat in the corner. She thought of the folded deed against her heart, and the letter that said, "For the stayer," and the ledger's last line about Bledsoe's paper. She thought of the old woman in black by the church, and the words about what had been set in the ground to be found by the one who stayed. She took her canvas coat from over the tin and put it on. She took the lantern from the shelf and lit it. She took the length of rope she had been using for her belt and coiled it over her shoulder. "Stay here," she said. "Keep the stove hot." "You can't," the woman said. "The creek." "I know the creek," Lucy said, though she had known it only a week. "Bar the door behind me." She went out into the storm. The rain came at her sideways off the ridge. Lucy Boone bent her head under the brim of her hat and followed the creek road with the lantern held low, the light making a small yellow pool that the wind kept trying to blow out. The creek had jumped its bank in 2 places she could see, and a third she could only hear. She walked west along the road toward the bend where the water ran deepest, calling once, then twice, her voice thin against the drumming on her hat. On the 3rd call, she heard an answer that was not the creek. It came from below the road, past a thicket of willow bent almost flat under the wind. She found him wedged against a cottonwood root, hip deep in cold water, one arm around the trunk and the other around the neck of a mare who was too tired to swim any farther. He was a man of about 30, dark-haired, coat gone, a gash above one eye. Lucy set the lantern on a stone above the water line and uncoiled the rope from her shoulder. She tied one end around the cottonwood above him and tossed the other into the water. He caught it on the 2nd try. She braced her boots against the root and pulled. The mare came out first, half scrambling, half hauled, and stood shaking on the bank with her sides heaving. Then the man. He could not stand at first. Lucy got her shoulder under his arm and walked him 100 yards up the road to where the ground rose. She left the mare tied to a fence post with the last of her rope and got the man to the porch of the Hanley place before the lantern went out. Inside, the woman cried without sound when she saw him. The boy climbed off the bedroll and put his small hand on his father's knee and left it there. Lucy laid the man on the bedroll by the stove, cut his wet shirt away from the gash, cleaned it with hot water and a strip torn from her own apron, and bound it with another strip. She fed the stove until the room was hot enough to hurt the skin. She brought the mare into the barn beside Amos and rubbed her down with a handful of dry hay. Amos put his nose against the other horse's shoulder and breathed out once. The storm blew itself thin by dawn. By mid-morning, the creek had fallen back inside its bank, and the sun came out weak and white. The man could sit up and take bread. His name was John Meeker. He and his wife Hannah and the boy had been bound for a homestead her brother held 2 valleys east. He owed Lucy his life, and said so plainly. Lucy said the stove had done the work, and poured him more tea. Word travels fast in a valley with only one road. By that afternoon, a wagon came down the rise, driven by a man from the freight line who had found the Meekers' broken rig against a snag 2 miles downstream and followed the wheel tracks up. Behind him rode the doctor from Dry Creek, a lean, gray-bearded man named Whitfield, who had been sent for by someone in town before the road was even passable. Dr. Whitfield examined the gash above John Meeker's eye, stitched it with 3 neat stitches, and said the girl at the Hanley place had done the harder work already. He said it looking at Lucy. By the following morning, the yard of the Hanley place had more people in it than it had held in 4 winters. A woman from the church brought a basket of cornbread and would not take it back. 2 men from the livery came with fresh planks and a keg of nails and said they had heard the porch step was rotted through. A boy of 10 stood at the pen rail feeding Amos a carrot without asking. The chorus that had laughed on the boardwalk did not know quite where to put its hands. That afternoon, a slight man in a black coat and a clean collar rode down the rise on a small sorrel. He introduced himself as Mr. Ainsley, the county clerk out of the seat 2 days east. He had come, he said, on account of a letter sent by Dr. Whitfield, and on account of a matter that had waited 4 winters to be heard. Lucy took him into the front room and set the tin on the pine floor between them and unlocked it with the small iron key from her apron pocket. Mr. Ainsley read the older deed first, then the letter of intent, then the last page of the ledger. He read them a second time. He set his hands flat on his knees. "This is in order," he said quietly. "This is more than in order." He looked at Lucy over the rim of his spectacles. "The lien claimed against this parcel is not lawful. It never was. Mr. Hanley told the office as much before he died, and the paper was misfiled. That is on us." He paused. "The coin will settle what taxes stand. The deed in your name and this letter together will settle the rest. The ground is yours, Miss Boone. Free and held." Lucy did not speak for a long moment. Then she nodded once and thanked him and asked him if he would take a cup of tea. He said he would. Mr. Bledsoe rode down the rise the next morning in his black coat and his silver watch chain and his clean boots, and this time he took the hat off before he stepped onto the porch. Lucy met him at the door. He did not laugh. He looked past her at the swept floor and the small iron stove and the tin in the corner and the man on the bedroll with the boy asleep against his side. He said he had come to see for himself. He said the clerk had ridden to his place that morning and shown him a paper. He said the paper spoke plainly, and he had no quarrel with it. His voice was not the voice it had been outside the barber's. "Miss Boone," he said, "I misjudged the ground, and the one on it." Lucy did not answer at once. Then she said, "The ground kept its own counsel." Bledsoe put his hat back on and rode up the rise, and did not come down it again except once, weeks later. With a gift of fence wire he sat inside the pen without a word. By the end of that week, the story had traveled the length of the valley and back. The old woman in black came out from behind the church one evening with her tin pail and stood at the edge of Lucy's yard and looked at the barn and at Lucy and said nothing, because she had already said what needed saying. Then she turned and walked back toward town in the dusk. The Meekers stayed 9 days. When John Meeker could ride, they went on east to Hannah's brother's homestead with the mare and a sack of cornbread and a promise to come back through in the spring. Hannah stopped at the porch step, which was new pine now and solid under her weight, and put her hand against Lucy's cheek and did not say anything. The boy waved from the wagon until the rise hid them. Autumn came slowly to the valley. Lucy Boone paid the county what the ledger said was owed, and Mr. Ainsley brought her a paper stamped and signed that made the Hanley place hers in a way that would hold against any weather. She spent the coin that was left on a milk cow, 100 weight of seed oats, a keg of nails, 2 panes of window glass, and a pair of good gloves. She kept 2 of the small gold pieces in the tin, and the tin she kept in the corner by the stove where the wall was soundest, and the small iron key she wore on the leather thong around her neck, under her dress, against her heart, next to the folded deed. The barn came up straight before the first frost. The men from the livery and 2 neighbors from up the creek helped her set the ridge beam. She fed them at noon on the new porch. When they were gone, she stood in the middle stall where the mound had been, and looked at the swept dirt and the mended wall and the light coming through the loft window in a long, clean bar. The mark on the beam she left where it was, on a golden evening in late October, when the pines on the ridge were black against a sky the color of a copper kettle. Lucy Boone sat on the top step of the mended porch, with Amos loose in the yard, cropping the new grass that had come up after the rains. The milk cow stood in the pen. Smoke rose thin and straight from the stone chimney. The wind, for once, was still. Dr. Whitfield had ridden out that afternoon to check on a barn cat with a bad paw, and had stayed for coffee and gone. Before he left, standing by his horse with the last of the light on his face, he had asked her what she called the place now that it was hers. She had not answered him then. She had only smiled, because the answer had not come. It came now, sitting on the step with Amos in the yard and the copper sky over the ridge. She said it aloud, softly, to no one and to everything. I did not take a farm, she said. I stayed until it was mine. Amos lifted his head at the sound of her voice, held it a moment, and lowered it again to the grass. The light on the ridge went from copper to rose to a deep blue at the edges of the world. Lucy Boone drew the folded deed from beneath her dress and held it a moment in her hand and put it back against her heart, and the small iron key beside it, warm from her skin. Thank you for staying to the end of Lucy Boone's story, for walking with her through the dust and the wind and the long, patient work of a year that made a home from what the world had thrown away. If this quiet return to belonging moved you, leave a like, share a word in the comments where you're listening from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Another lantern is already lit down the road, and we will meet you there.